It is quite apt to say that individuals shape history. We see throughout the grand narrative of the history of humanity that various figures have arose who shape the ideas, philosophies, and theologies of mankind for thousands of years. Such figures include the great Jesus of Nazareth, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, of Arabia, the Buddha, Moses, who was sent to the Israelites, Guru Nanak, and many more. However, in many cases, it's the figures that we know very little about, the enigmatic, mysterious figures, those who may not be present in the collective conscience and the collective memory of most of mankind. However, for scholarship and learned people, these figures are incredibly important in the development of ideas, even if we know very little about them. A case study for such a figure would be the early Islamic philosopher, the infamous yet enigmatic Jahm bin Safwan. Jahm bin Safwan, who is often credited with being the first to prioritize reason over revelation, was supposedly influenced by the ideas of external philosophies, such as the Sumaniya, an Indian Buddhist sect, and he was reported as having been influenced by Greek philosophers. Amongst his beliefs and views, as has partly been mentioned, is his prioritization of intellect over revelation. But furthermore, he denied the attributes of God, ta'atil, as is the Arabic term, and he also engaged in a few other acts and a few other beliefs, such as irja. He believed that iman, meaning Islamic belief, was simply knowing or recognizing the fact that God existed. And apart from that, all that was needed was this simple ma'rifah, this simple recognition of God's existence to attain eternal salvation. Ironically, however, we know very little on an authentic historical basis about Jahm. The reason being is most of the primary historical literature written about Jahm comes 2 to 3 centuries after his passing away. And so it raises an important question. Even if many caricatures have been made of him, and he serves as an important polemical tool for many sects today in Orthodox Sunni circles, and even if he serves supposedly as an important figure in the development of Islamic theology, can we be certain that many of the ideas attributed to him are actually authentic? Did he even influence Islamic theology in the first place? Was it really his ideas that would go on to influence Islamic theology, or were they someone else's entirely? What if Jahm is just a fictional character? What if he has certain views that are misattributed to him? These are important questions to understand. This case study gives us an insight into how heresiography and religious and theological and philosophical polemics often operate, especially within the pre-modern and medieval worlds. It also gives us an insight into how, in many cases, enigmatic and mysterious figures go on to influence humanity and mankind's ideas about religion and theology and philosophy in ways which many people may not understand or comprehend. Furthermore, and most importantly, sometimes it's the seemingly insignificant events that shape our ideas for generations to come. As has been mentioned, a seemingly insignificant and minor Islamic philosopher went on, according to his opponents at least, and at least according to heresiographers, to play such an important role in the development and the influencing of various Islamic sects and the development of Islamic theology and philosophy. This case study of the life of Jahm bin Safwan and the role that he plays in Islamic theology and how heresiography and historical study and polemics often deals with this figure, shall be divided into various parts for time's sake, but also so that each video made on each subtopic in this chapter can do at least attempt to do justice to this topic, as there is a lot of details and nuances that has to be discussed. This first video has served as a brief introduction to this case study. As we have mentioned, individuals shape history. This is a common determinist and voluntarist debate. Within the modern world, we tend to view individuals or people as subject to material, economic, or cultural forces outside of their control. In other words, they are determined to act in a certain way. This is a common trope within many Marxist circles. For example, Karl Marx was famously concerned with how economic factors determine the actions of people. Furthermore, Althusser, the structuralist Marxist thinker, talks about ideological state apparatuses and how these serve to ideologically indoctrinate people or the working class into the dominant sort of ruling class ideology. However, other Marxists, such as neo-Marxists and action Marxists, for example, take Gramsci or Taylor et al., would reject this view. And they would say, well, look, people have free will. People are not passive puppets. They don't just blindly accept everything that's given to them. They're free to shape history how they want, and they're free to create ideas, and they are free to develop their own ideas and expand their own set of knowledge by their own free will. They aren't just entirely determined by people. In other words, the debate comes down to this. Do individuals shape society, or does society shape individuals? To a certain point, this debate is rather circular. In other words, it leads to quite circular logic. Society shapes individuals, individuals shape society, and it just continues occurring. The reality, for me personally at least, is that the founding blocks or the foundations of a society are the individuals which live in it. These individuals go on to have a great impact within those societies. And even if there may have been societies such as pre-modern or medieval societies which restricted certain human freedoms, we could still see very organic developments within ideas such as religion, theology, philosophy, by individuals who used their free will to develop these ideas and expand upon them. If we take Jahm as an example, Jahm could have conformed to the traditionalist Islamic views and beliefs of his time. He could have also agreed to following any one of the other sects or any one of the other philosophies or any one of the other theologies at the time. However, Jahm took it into his own hands, for better or for worse, depending on who you ask, to develop his own unique theology and philosophy. So whilst he was a Muslim by identity, he had a very interesting and unique interpretation of the Quranic text. In particular, he was one of the first ones to prioritize reason over revelation. Furthermore, he, like has been mentioned, denied many of the attributes of God. And he also engaged in irja, when he said that Iman is simply ma'rifah, recognition of God's existence. As such, Jahm was not simply influenced by his society to just believe in what everyone else said, but he took it upon himself to think for himself. Even if not all of his ideas are necessarily correct, he still came up with original ideas. As his opponents and many heresiographers and historians and those who engage in religious polemics would later argue, his ideas would go on to have a major influence in later Islamic theology. In particular, many argue that his ideas influenced the later sects who engaged in rational theology. The Mu'tazila supposedly would have been influenced by Jahm's ideas, and many have argued that the Ash'ari and Maturidi schools were influenced by the Mu'tazila. So you can see this chain of influence of each of these sects of rational theology, which ultimately goes back to Jahm bin Safwan. As such, we see the power of individuals to shape the ideas of others and to shape schools of rational and theological thought that would go on to dominate the Muslim world in particular for 1,000 or so years to come. In future videos, we shall seek to examine, first of all, principles of heresiography, how heresiography in the Muslim world in particular tends to work, what are some fundamental principles by which we can understand this sort of field of study, and then we will discuss the life of Jahm. We will discuss the life of his teacher Jahm bin Dirham, who's also a very important figure, and we will discuss the role that he plays in modern day religious polemics, in particular between the Salafi and Ash'ari movements, and the role he played traditionally in religious polemics and in heresiography, and how his ideas were traditionally understood and how they are understood in modern times. Thanks for watching. Peace.